Fewer queens have captivated the modern imagination as much as the ill-fated and often hated French Queen Marie Antoinette. She never said let them eat cake, by the way. She has been portrayed on stage and screen countless times, including in the much-maligned film, by historians at least, Marie Antoinette, in which she was played by Kirsten Dunst. Check it out, it's got an awesome soundtrack. For over 2 centuries, Marie Antoinette has served, fairly or not, as a symbol of the decadence and corruption that brought down the French monarchy. This French Revolution not only shattered the French monarchy, but it also unleashed a wave of change across the continent of Europe. In France, at least for a quarter of a century, it was no longer good to be the king, as the following episode will reveal. It was October 6, 1789, just a few short months after the outbreak of the French Revolution. Marie and her husband, King Louis XVI, were at the famous Palace of Versailles that had been built by his great-grandfather, Louis. As you have already seen, no greater symbol of the absolutist model of government existed. Yet at this particular moment, outside the palace was gathered a crowd of thousands of Parisian women clamoring for relief from rising bread prices. Mobs have a mind of their own, of course, whether in real life or on Twitter, and before long the angry crowd began calling for the removal of the king to Paris. Easier to keep an eye on the royal family there. Marie Antoinette, fearing for the lives of herself and their 2 children, locked herself in her chambers. Before long, the crowd had entered the palace and killed 2 of the queen's bodyguards. Marie and her 2 children escaped to the king's chambers, which were more secure, by way of a secret staircase. A secret staircase, by the way, constructed to allow the very shy, private King Louis to slip into the queen's chambers for conjugal visits unnoticed. Later that day, the royal family appeared on a balcony in front of the crowd and promised to return to Paris with them. King Louis, Marie Antoinette, and the children were now effectively prisoners of the revolution and would never see Versailles again. And while Louis still believed there might be some way to reign in the revolution, he had no way of knowing that in less than 4 years, the French monarchy would be overthrown and that he and Marie would be beheaded. Your textbook breaks down this French Revolution, of which this story I just told is a major element, into 4 distinct phases spanning the years 1789 to 1815. I mention this because noting these stages provides us as students of history an opportunity to see change over time. For example, your textbook describes the first phase from 1789 to 1792 as a relatively peaceful, constitutional phase. But in 1792, France and much of the rest of Europe was soon engulfed in war. The reaction to foreign and domestic threats to the revolution led to a second phase marked by what your textbook calls acute crisis, consolidation, and repression. While the infant French Republic was saved, revolutions have a tendency, as they say, to eat their own, and the Republic entered a third phase from 1794 to 1799, marked by continued war, corruption, and internal division. The weaknesses of the Republican government made it easy prey for an ambitious young man from the Mediterranean island of Corsica named Napoleon Bonaparte, who ushered in the 4th and final phase of the revolution. Napoleon was one of the greatest generals the world has ever seen. He ruled France from 1799 to 1814, only brought down by an alliance made up by the rest of Europe's great powers, such as the United Kingdom, Prussia, and Russia. Yet during his relatively short 15 years in power, he brought much of the rest of Europe under his thumb, all the while promising to spread the ideals of the French Revolution to the rest of the continent of Europe. And while the monarchy ended up being restored in France after Napoleon, the passions and ideals of the revolution could not be completely put back in the bottle. As we will be seeing in later chapters and lessons, the nations and kingdoms of Europe spent the rest of the 19th century wrestling with the consequences of the revolution and Napoleon's short-lived empire. The fact that the French Revolution encompasses such a broad period with monumental change throughout makes it difficult to assess as a wholly positive or negative event, but it does allow us to ask some thought-provoking questions. History is all about inquiry, remember? What were the long-term causes of the French Revolution? Was it class conflict, social division, the effects of Enlightenment concepts filtering down to broader French society? Think back to what I just said about there being 4 phases to the revolution. Why was there change in the midst of this revolution? Better put, why did a revolution supposedly based on the concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity end up leading to the rise of someone like Napoleon? Speaking of Napoleon, he always argued that much of what he did was to protect the principles of the revolution. Was this the case? Or was Napoleon merely trying to protect his legacy and justify his conquests? Needless to say, historians do not agree on the answers to these questions, nor should they. The point here is not to get bogged down in pointless academic debate, but to try to help us understand that for us to truly understand the past, we must recognize the complexity of the human story and get past looking for easy answers. So as you read through this chapter and progress through the different phases of this era, keep these questions in mind. I will think you find that they will help you organize your thoughts and have a better understanding of causes and consequences, especially as they relate to a major turning point in the history of Western civilization.